Very good. Welcome everyone and namaste. Thank you so much for being here with us today, this evening, at least Omaha time, it's evening. And this is the very first talk that I will have been giving on our Discord server. Before I begin, however, first I just want to thank several people. First of all, I think I mentioned this a few times, but I want to mention it again. The idea of having this Discord server itself is something that I had contemplated for quite a long time. I wanted us to have some sort of very healthy sort of internet forum like this, where students and devotees of the International Sanatana Dharma Society could get together and have fellowship, have association, be able to speak with each other, inspire each other, etc. And truthfully, I had wanted to do something like this for many years. But just due to lack of time on my part, I wasn't able to start anything like this. And then, very wonderfully, several of my students told me that they had started a Discord server for exactly that purpose. And very humbly, they asked if that was all right with me and if they had my permission to do this. And I told them, absolutely, please do this. I had wanted this for years. So first of all, I want to thank the individuals who, again, started this Discord server for starting this. This is something that I know has been absolutely wonderful for people. You know, I myself am rarely, if ever, on here. If I am, it tends to be for about 1 minute or 2 minutes, maybe once a month or something like that. But I have heard from so many people that this Discord server has been a lifesaver, has been a lifeline, has been something that has been so tremendously helpful for many, many, many people who find themselves very sincerely attracted to Sanatana Dharma and who, again, want association and fellowship. So thank you to the people who started this. Thank you also to all of the moderators. We have many, many moderators who are absolute experts at what they are doing. Thank you for your dedication in looking over, watching over this very sacred place. And let me tell people, the reason why I decided to give this talk is because I was informed by several of my serious students who are on this Discord server that over the last several months, since the server started actually, there have been many, many different questions regarding, very specifically, questions around the topics of celibacy, of what it means to have a healthy sexual relationship, marriage relationship, dating relationship, etc., within the Vedic context. And then questions ranging from the most general of questions to questions that are very, very, very specific. And indeed, there have been so many questions along these lines to the point where I decided I should give a talk about this. And that's what I'm doing today. And this talk is entitled The Way of the Brahmachari. And very specifically, I'm going to be first giving a talk, and it will be a talk. It's going to be maybe 40 minutes or so, talking about what it means to be a Brahmachari. That means being a celibate student, very specifically. That is what this talk is about. And again, I'm going to be giving a talk going very in-depth, probably more in-depth than you've ever heard in your life, or more in-depth than any guru has ever given, at least in contemporary times, on this topic of what it means to be a Brahmachari. What is Brahmacharya? Or, again, the celibate lifestyle. So after I give this talk for approximately 40 minutes or so, more or less, might be 35, it might be 50, then at that point, I want to open things up for questions and answers. Very good. Well, first of all, before we begin, I want to first talk a little bit about what precisely is Brahmacharya. What precisely does this mean? Well, Brahmacharya is the state. Brahmachari is the individual who follows Brahmacharya. And Brahmacharya, very, very simply, is a compound Sanskrit word that is composed of two different words. Brahma means that which is of God. And then Charya. Some people think it's Acharya. It's not. It's Charya. That's the word. Which means conduct. So that conduct which is godly. Divine conduct. That is quite literally what the word Brahmacharya means. And then again, Brahmachari is an individual who follows such divine conduct. Now, this means divine conduct certainly in general, that is, being a yogi, being an individual who is spiritual, who is virtuous, etc. But very specifically, it indeed means an individual who is celibate. That is, an individual who is not engaging in the loss of semen, to be very, very specific. So a brahmachari is indeed an individual who is celibate. This is what is meant by this term. Now, having said this, before I go much deeper into what it means to be a brahmachari, which I'm going to a little bit later actually, first I want to talk a little bit more widely about where this concept of being a celibate student falls within the greater Vedic context. It's important to do this both for historical reasons, but also again to kind of set the place of where the brahmachari fits in the entire scope of Vedic civilization. Once we do that, then a little bit later I'm going to go very deeply, actually, probably more deeply than anyone has ever heard before, as far as what it means to be a brahmachari, how one practices this, etc. So let's start first of all with the idea of what are called the Chatur ashramas, that is the 4 ashramas. So in Vedic civilization, there are 4 stages of life. This is in accordance with Vedic social science. There are 4 stages in life. With the very first stage of life, this is in fact what is called the Brahmacharya stage. This is the stage especially in which an individual is to be celibate. And that means when a person is ranging from a child up into, and now this will differ in accordance with many different factors, but let's say up until one is approximately 18 to 25. Something like that. And this roughly corresponds, interestingly, with how things are even done in the modern West. In fact, all 4 of these ashramas, we'll see, pretty much fit with what is done in the West as well. The only difference being that in the Vedic context, all 4 of these stages are radically spiritualized. They are spiritual in purpose. But again, just like in the West, the idea is that in the early stage of life, an individual is meant to be a student. That is the time in their life when they are growing. That's the time in their life when they're going to school, when they're learning all the different topics, where they are growing physically. They are growing quite literally physically, but they are also trying to optimize their health as much as possible. They are growing emotionally, etc., etc. So this is what is called the Brahmacharya stage. This then is followed by what is called the Grihastha stage. In the Grihastha stage, an individual is then a householder. That's quite literally what Grihastha means. Hasta means to hold or in one's hand, and Griha means a home or house. It's in this stage that an individual now pursues their career. They get married, they have children, they buy a home, etc., etc., etc. So they take care of all of the material aspects of life, but again, of course, also coupled with spirituality, because the idea is, again, not perfectly aligned with the Western idea that, oh, at this certain stage, once you've graduated college, you're no longer a student, now you get married, and now it's all materialism, materialism, materialism. You become a good consumer. No, that's the Western idea. In the Vedic idea, indeed, this is a time in Grihastha, this second stage, where you do indeed begin to focus a little bit more on material aspects of life. But at the same time, the idea is that your entire life, even as a householder, is permeated with the spiritual. So that's the second stage. Vanaprastha is the third stage. It is at this stage that one slowly begins the process of retiring from all of one's material pursuits. And now, again, in a more concerted sort of way, you begin to focus on spirituality. Then finally, there is sannyasa. This is the very last stage of life that ordinarily takes place when a person is older than 75. And at this stage, you become completely renounced, and again, you become an individual who, again, is celibate and who is focusing completely on God. Now, all throughout my talk, I'm going to be actually quoting verses from all throughout the Vedic scriptures that explain all the various things that I'm talking about. So for this, the 4 ashramas, I'm going to quote for you from Mahabharata Shanti Parva, chapter 60, verse 2. And this is how this quote goes. The four modes, that is the four ashramas, are Vanaprastha, Sannyasa, Grihastha of great merit, and Brahmacharya, which is adopted by the Brahmanas. Very nice. So this is, again, from Mahabharata, and it's explaining these four stages that I just explained to you. And it is interesting how this verse ends by saying very specifically that Brahmacharya is adopted by the Brahmanas. In other words, it is understood that Brahmacharya is the most important of all of these four ashramas. Because it's foundational, because as a young person, if you want to have a good foundation in every way, health-wise, spiritually, philosophically, etc., to the rest of your life, first you establish yourself in Brahmacharya. So that's the first thing of importance. Also, the reason why it's mentioned that this is adopted by Brahmanas, and again, we're going to talk about this very in depth later, is because Brahmacharya is something that can be practiced even later in life for certain periods of time, when one especially wants to refocus their attention upon God. So even as a married person, you can choose to do a vrata, a vow, where, let's say for whatever it is, a month, half a year, however long, you take a vow where you say, I will be celibate for this period of time to focus my awareness more upon God. So that being said, celibacy is a state that is found in only two really of these ashramas. It's found again when one is a brahmachari, that is at the very beginning of life, and then when one is a sannyasi at the very end of one's life. Now, all that being said, again, I'm going to be quoting not so much from a Vedic scripture, but an ancient Vedic dictionary that is very much well recognized. It's called the Amarakosha Dictionary, and this is a very good dictionary of Sanskrit terms. So under the title Brahmachari, this is what the Amarakosha Dictionary says. Brahmachari is a spiritual way of acting. That is Brahmacharya. So again, by Brahmachari, there is this twofold understanding that it is divine conduct, generally speaking, so thus anyone can really and should engage in divine conduct, but it also means celibacy, very specifically. Now, all this being said, now I'm going to go very, very deeply into some aspects of Vedic history that many people are not aware of. You know, one thing that I feel always very tasked to do is to not only explain Sanatana Dharma in a straightforward sort of way, but also to explain many of the misconceptions that are there as well, and to try to correct many of the misconceptions. Indeed, there are ideas that some people may have about Sanatana Dharma, about any of these terms, for example, that may have been taught for hundreds and hundreds of years, and in some cases even by all sorts of gurus, etc. However, the truth of the matter is that when we look historically, we understand that some of these practices are somewhat more recent. So, for example, the idea of literally lifelong celibacy, that is the idea that an individual can take sannyasa at the age of 20 and be a celibate sannyasi for all of their life, that's not Vedic. That's going to come as an absolute shock to many individuals, even people who think they know Vedic spirituality extremely well. But the idea, of taking sannyas very young, but also of strict monasticism. And in a moment, I'm going to explain what I mean by that. Both of these ideas are not Vedic. Rather, they are interestingly Buddhist and then Advaitin. These ideas of a lifelong celibacy as a common thing, as a common idea, but also the idea of monasticism. That is the idea of a group of men being celibate and living in an institution together for the rest of their lives. These ideas are not found in the Vedic scriptures in any way, shape, or form whatsoever. And indeed, this will come as a surprise to people. Rather, the first, let's say, individuals who began to live this sort of lifestyle of lifelong celibacy, of men living together in a building, so monasticism, this started with Buddhism, actually. Previous to Buddhism, in actual Vedic spirituality, it was understood that no, celibacy had its place, but only at certain parts of time of one's life. So again, at the beginning as a brahmachari, at the end as a sannyasi, but then certain periods when a person takes a vow of celibacy for a short period of time, and that was it. Otherwise, the vast majority of individuals who were Vedic were considered to be people who should eventually become married. Now, were there a tiny number of individuals who indeed were celibate for all of their lives? That is, they were born celibate, they remained celibate, they never got married, they left this world in a celibate state? Absolutely. Absolutely. But again, if you look at the actual Vedic scriptures, the number of such individuals who were celibate all of their lives without ever getting married are tiny, even among great sages. We're not even talking about the general populace. Even among great sages, and again, this may come as a surprise to some people, it really shouldn't if you've read the Vedic scriptures. Even among great sages, the vast majority of them also were indeed married individuals. So whether we're talking about the rishis, whether we're talking about great yogis, etc., the vast majority of these individuals are recorded in the Vedic scriptures as having been married people, who in fact were married and in many cases even had children. But now, when it comes to the idea of monasticism very specifically, again, the idea of monasticism is something that was introduced by Buddhism in the form of what was called the Buddhist Sangha, and then it was introduced into the Vedic context by Shankaracharya in the 9th century as a result of his trying to combat Buddhism philosophically and institutionally. Now, on the one hand, there are a lot of, today especially, a lot of problems with the idea of monasticism, which I'll get into in just a moment. But at the same time, when indeed you have an order of celibate men who all live together and have taken vows for life to be celibate, that is indeed a very powerful force. That is something that Buddhism used very, very effectively to spread Buddhist doctrine all throughout the world. Shankaracharya, having seen this and having seen the effectiveness of Buddhist preaching, instituted the same idea in Vedic spirituality. So he instituted the idea of monasticism as opposed to an ashram, which I'll give the distinction between the two in just a minute or so. So Shankaracharya himself introduced the idea of monasticism into Vedic spirituality, as well as the idea of individuals taking sannyas at a very early age. Again, previous to Shankara, this was a very rare thing. It's not that it wasn't done. Certainly, once in a blue moon, you would have a person previous to Shankara in the Vedic context who would take sannyasa at the age of 20, 25, etc., but it was extremely rare. It was understood that sannyasa was the last ashrama that one did at the age of 75 or above. So Shankaracharya, having introduced these two concepts of monasticism and lifelong celibacy into Vedic spirituality, this then of course became translated into many of the sampradayas of Sanatana Dharma, to the point where indeed you'll find Vaishnava sampradayas, as we know, where they follow both of these ideas of monasticism on the one hand, but also the idea of lifelong celibacy. But again, it is not something that is found really in the Vedic scriptures themselves. I want to quote another Vedic verse here. This is from Manava Dharma Shastra, chapter 3, verse 1. And this is very interesting. It says, quote, "The Brahmachari vow of studying the three Vedas under a guru must be kept for 36 years, or half of that time, 18 years, or a quarter, 19 years, or until the student has perfectly learnt them." So in other words, this verse, and there are many others in addition to this verse is making it very clear that, again, the idea of lifelong brahmacharya is not something that's actually recommended in the Vedic scriptures. Indeed, in accordance with this scripture, it makes it quite lenient, actually. It first recommends that a person should be a brahmachari for 36 years, but then half that time is fine too, 18. Half of that time, 9 years, is fine too. Or then it makes it very open, until the student has perfectly learned the Vedic scriptures. So again, there is a time limit for how long a person is a brahmachari, according to the Vedic scriptures. Indeed, you will find very few, if any, Vedic scriptures that say a person should be a brahmachari for the rest of their life. I have never encountered such a Vedic verse that says such a thing. Rather, it has a time limit. Here's another verse from Yajnavalkya Smriti. Brahmacharya of 16 years is required for studying each Veda, or at least 5 years. Some say it lasts till the end of one's education. At the age of 16 years, one's Keshanta Sanskara should take place. So again, there is a clear time limit as far as how long a person should be a brahmachari. The idea is that you are a brahmachari until you no longer need to be a brahmachari. Until you now have had your education, you have grown spiritually and physically and health-wise and emotionally and in every way, and now you are ready to move on to Grihastha. Now, when it comes to the idea of monasticism very specifically, and I've talked about this in other contexts, how, for example, with the International Sanatana Dharma Society, we endeavor always to follow Vedic spirituality in accordance with, again, how it was done 5,000 years ago, 10,000, 100,000 years ago, and in accordance with the Vedic scriptures. So this being the case, the ISDS does not stress monasticism. Anyone who is a serious follower of the ISDS knows this. You know, we don't have some institution where we have 20, 30, 50, 1,000 quote-unquote celibate men living there together in close quarters. This is not something that we believe because, again, it's not found in the scriptures on the one hand. On the other hand, it's something which leads to a lot of problems. And I'm going to speak about this very bluntly and very frankly with people, because I indeed lived in such an institution for approximately 8 years or so. And there's a reason why I stopped. And trust me, it was not because I was no longer capable of following the vows. On the contrary, I have followed the vows for all of my life, actually. But after about 8 years, I chose not to live in a Hindu monastery anymore. And the reason why is this. It has nothing to do with the sect in question. This is the case whether you're talking about a Christian monastery, Benedictine monastery, Franciscan monastery. This is true whether you're talking about a Buddhist monastery, whether you're talking about a Hindu monastery. And that is that when you have a large grouping of supposedly celibate men all living in close quarters together, it ends up being something that potentially is unhealthy sexually. Well, again, it leads to a very unhealthy situation when you have a group of men living together and a large group of men in close quarters, etc. So this is why we don't believe in monasticism, and this is why Vedic spirituality has never taught strict monasticism in this way. Rather than monasticism, in Vedic spirituality, there is the idea of the ashrama concept. And ashrama in this case meaning quite literally the place of the guru. A sacred place of learning, a sacred place where it is a spiritual hermitage. This is what we have found all throughout the history of Vedic spirituality, and again, especially ancient Vedic spirituality. We know, for example, that all of the rishis had ashramas. These were places that were primarily very deep in the forest, where indeed there would be a rishi, there would be a sage, a very great guru, who they themselves would live in this beautiful place that usually had multiple dwellings. There was the house of the guru. There were places where teachings would take place. There would be a makeshift temple. There would be indeed housing for brahmacharis, for individuals who were young students who would live there for just a determinate amount of time. In some cases 5 years, 10 years, maybe 20 years. But again, when they reached adulthood, soon thereafter, the idea would be that they would then get married and move on. The ashramas were not monasteries in the modern sense of that term. Rather, they were ashramas that housed students, celibate students, temporarily. And again, most of the gurus, most of the rishis, most of the sages who ran these ashrams themselves were married individuals. Again, just look up the name of most of the rishis who you can think of and look at their life story, look at their biography, and it will tell you literally the names of their wives. It will tell you how many children they had, etc. So this was the nature of actual ashramas, is that again they were not monasteries per se. The truth of the matter is that indeed, while Brahmacharya is something that is of extreme importance, that should indeed be practiced, especially by young people, and specifically young men, because men are indeed different from women in every way, physiologically, psychologically, emotionally, intellectually, etc. We're talking primarily about young men. When men are young especially, they should indeed practice Brahmacharya. They should practice celibacy. And that is the case indeed for many of the young men who are listening to me right now. This applies to you. This applies not just to the past. This applies not just to individuals who are quite literally living in ashrams under the tutelage of a guru. Rather, this applies to all young men who are out there who are indeed endeavoring to be spiritual people and to grow in every way. When you are young, and again, let's say roughly 25. Really, as far as what is the end point of that, it varies from person to person. In some cases, it's 22, 23, 24, 25. But let's say when you're under 25 especially, this is the time before you are married to be celibate and to focus all of your attention, all of your awareness, all of your actions and activities toward one thing, and that is growing personally in every way. But then, that being the case, then it's time to get married. And the truth of the matter is, it is specifically in marriage that marriage then is an ideal time to also continue to grow spiritually. Because again, this idea that, when you are a brahmachari, then you're radically spiritual, but then once you get married, you just become a complete materialist. No, that's not true. That's a horrific stereotype, actually. The truth of the matter is, it is especially, interestingly, when you are a married individual that you now have the time, that you now have the opportunity to grow tremendously spiritually. The reason why this is the case is because you now have these dual positive challenges. That on the one hand, you wish to grow spiritually and you have a spiritual mindset and you understand all of the practices, philosophy, etc., by which you can grow spiritually on the one hand. But on the other hand, you have the challenges of this world, which those challenges themselves add fuel for growth. You see, it's easy to be quote-unquote spiritual if you're living completely isolated from society. But then when you're in society, this is when you now need to encounter other people. You have to have social interactions with others. You need to have challenges, tests, etc., that you wouldn't ordinarily find if you're simply living in the safety of an ashram somewhere. So this is why, especially when a person is spiritual, this is a time when they can grow spiritually. And indeed, now engaging in indeed Vedic sexuality, that is legitimate sexuality with your wife, the truth of the matter is, you not only can continue to grow spiritually, but you can continue to practice a form of brahmacharya in that you are now indeed engaging in sexuality, but within the context of marriage, within the context of a thoroughly monogamous relationship with your wife. So let me quote yet again another verse from the Vedic scriptures, and in this case this is Skanda Purana, and this is 1:2:55:18. And this is explaining the concept of brahmacharya even within the context of marriage. So this verse says, abstinence from sexual intercourse, mentally, verbally, and physically, in the case of ascetics, is called brahmacharya, that is the vow of celibacy. In the case of householders, having sexual intercourse during the period after the 4 days of menses is not opposed to the vow of celibacy. So how interesting that, again, a person can, even within the context of marriage, a person can indeed, to quote this, engage in sexual intercourse, yet it is not considered to be something that is opposed to brahmacharya. And why? We're talking about, of course, a couple, a married couple, who are also very spiritual people, who are essentially living the lives of yogis within the material world, and even they're engaging in sexual activities. If they do so piously, in accordance with Vedic injunctions, they also are considered to be brahmacharis. according to the Skanda Purana. Very interesting. Now, let's go on just a little bit more. And I want to talk very briefly about the Purusharthas at this point. The Purusharthas are something that are very important, very interesting, that are rarely spoken of. And I should say in the modern context, rarely spoken of. In the Vedic context, these are spoken about all the time. The Purusharthas are the four aims of man. That's quite literally how you translate Purusha Artha. Artha means aim and Purusha means man. So these are the four aims of human beings. And what these are very specifically are Dharma, Artha, Kama, and Moksha. Every human being is considered to be an individual who throughout the course of their life will pursue all four of these things. So again, Dharma, Artha, Kama, and Moksha. And let me talk about these very specifically. First, of course, there is Dharma. Every human being, in order to be considered human, must throughout the totality of their life pursue Dharma. That is, they must pursue the noble path, the path of virtue, the path of natural law. Every individual human being must live their life from the beginning of their life to the very end of their life and beyond in accordance with God's laws, in accordance with the natural way. So that is what Dharma is. Second, there is Artha. Artha has several different meanings. It's interesting, actually. Artha means both aim, it means politics, interestingly. It also means the acquisition of wealth, prosperity, etc. And in this case, the use of the term Artha means all the above. It means all of these things. That is, that a person should, once they are married, etc., they should pursue all of these worldly things. But again, in a spiritual way, in a dharmic sort of way. So we begin with Dharma, and then we have Artha. Now you see how these also correspond with the four ashramas. When a person is a Brahmachari, this is when they are learning about Dharma. When now they are beginning their life as a householder, now they pursue Artha, that is, they pursue the things of this world. But now there's the third one, and this is the one that we're getting to especially, and that is Kama. Kama means sex life. Kama means desire, quite literally. It means desire, it means sex life, it means engaging in the, let's say, sexual pleasures of this world within the context of monogamous marriage. So this indeed is considered to be one of the aims of human beings, one of the dharmic aims, not just a materialistic aim. Indeed, these Purusharthas are for individuals who are strictly following Vedic spirituality. So Kama, that is, sexuality, has its place in Vedic spirituality, but again, only within this context of Grihastha, of being in a monogamous married relationship, a man married to a woman, period. Nothing else is recognized anywhere in Vedic spirituality, or for that matter, any traditional religious form upon the face of the earth. Then finally, there's Moksha. There is moksha. And this, of course, corresponds with Vanaprastha and Sannyasa. That at this point, one is seeking moksha. One is seeking to pursue liberation from the material world. So thus, a Vedic person, a person who is indeed following the Vedic way, is meant to pursue all four of these items. And again, the only way legitimately and in a healthy way that a person can pursue all four of these is if we indeed follow the ashrama system, being Brahmachari, Grihastha, Vanaprastha, and then finally Sannyasi. Very good. Now, all of that being said, I'm going to go on now to a very, very important and what I hope will be very interesting aspect of the concept of being a Brahmachari. And that is the benefits, the actual benefits to an individual of being a Brahmachari, being celibate. And that being said, again, I'm going to quote from a Vedic scripture, and in this case, the Yoga Sutras. And this is from chapter 2, or Pada 2, verse 38. And this is Patanjali, and he says, being grounded in celibacy, Brahmacharya, one acquires vigor and vitality. Being grounded in Brahmacharya, one acquires vigor and vitality. So now we're going to talk again about some of the benefits of being a Brahmachari, being celibate. And indeed, Patanjali says it right here. being celibate is something that is considered to be first and foremost very practically something that is extremely healthy for the person done the right way, and this is what's important. Done not in a haphazard sort of way, because anything that is serious, anything that is a serious practice, done in a haphazard sort of way can sometimes have the opposite of the results that you want. But again, being a brahmachari, practicing celibacy in the correct, healthy sort of way is something that can lead to tremendous health for the individual. And all that being said, let me first of all, and now we're getting very practical, let me talk about the three modes, let's say, in which one can observe brahmacharya or celibacy. The first of these modes is in, again, as we were saying before, being either a brahmachari itself, that is in the early stage of life, or being a sannyasi in the last stage of life. So in accordance with the ashrama system. This is the first way in which an individual can choose to be celibate. The second way is by taking a limited vrata, a limited vow, a vow that is limited in time. And a person will do this for a very specific reason. Sometimes a person will do this in order to even gain a boon, actually, from a god or goddess. We have all sorts of instances like this, where a person will appeal to a specific god or goddess, and they'll take a vow, and they'll say, I will be celibate for 30 days, for 60 days, for 6 months. They'll take a vow of celibacy, and they'll take other vows. I will say this mantra a certain number of times a day, and I will fast on these days, etc., etc. So you'll have an individual who will take a vow like this. In some cases, a person will take a vow of celibacy just generally to sort of recharge their batteries. You know, they just kind of feel inspired to become celibate for some time. They may even be married at the time, and with the permission of their wife, you always want to get your wife's permission before you do this. It's not fair to not do so. A married man will say, I've chosen I'm going to be celibate for 30 days because I just want to strengthen my relationship with God, and I feel truly called to do this. And a person will do such a thing, etc. And then finally, there is, again, as we mentioned, those few individuals who indeed take a lifelong vow of brahmacharya. But again, that's extremely rare. But those are the three sorts of modes of being a brahmachari. Now, all that being said, it's interesting. A brahmachari is someone who, more than anything, is very consciously, very purposefully practicing what today is called, indeed, semen retention. See, this is the idea, is that in men, and again, I do not mean to say anything that is going to exclude women in any way. That's not the purpose of my saying what I'm about to say. Rather, it's just being very biologically realistic. Men and women physiologically, emotionally, psychologically, even psychically, etc. are not the same. Men have their concerns as far as their psychophysical nature. Women have theirs. So there is indeed a difference. So when it comes to the idea of semen retention, this is something that applies exclusively to men. This does not apply to women in any way whatsoever. But the idea of semen retention is, interestingly, something that's become very prevalent, I've seen, in the last just several years. Now, if you go to YouTube, if you go to just so many different places, you can look up hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of videos and articles and websites, etc., talking about the benefits of semen retention. The reason why this is the case is because it's been understood by all of the ancients. This is true Vedically. This is true by Buddhist adepts, by Jainas. This is true for the Greco-Romans. Indeed, Hippocrates speaks about this, about the benefits of semen retention. So many individuals, again, throughout the ancient world, not just Vedic, understood that when a man loses his semen, and especially doing it in a wasteful sort of way, that is, not engaging in a monogamous relationship with his wife, but just quite literally kind of losing semen just for the thrill of it. What ends up happening is a man becomes sapped of his vitality. He loses his power. He loses his vitality. Semen contains within it nutrients that are almost irreplaceable. And I want to quote from, again, another very important work. This is the Ashtanga Hridaya, which is actually a very important Ayurvedic work, very specifically. It's not very well known. but it's a very important work on Ayurveda that's very ancient, actually. And this is from Grihastha, chapter 3, verses 62 and 63. And this talks about the importance of semen and how semen is considered to be a very, very important fluid for men that men should retain. And this is how this verse goes. Blood is formed from the essence of plasma. Muscles from the essence of blood. Fat from muscles. Bone from fat. Marrow from bones. And reproductive fluid, semen, from marrow. From these semen, an embryo gets formed. So it's interesting, this has been described in several Vedic scriptures, but also I believe in modern science as well. I know Taoists have spoken about this as well, how it takes anywhere from 40 to 60 drops of blood to create one drop of semen. So thus, to replace semen is not an easy thing. It's something that should not be wasted in any way whatsoever. And indeed, the idea of being a brahmachari, the idea of semen retention, is the idea that rather than the semen being something which, representing our essence, is flowing downward and out, rather it should be the opposite. Urdhvaretasa is the Sanskrit term for this, and that means one whose semen flows upward. This is also one of the names of a brahmachari. This is how a brahmachari is described. One whose semen is not going outward and being wasted, but one whose semen, interestingly, is being retained within the system and is going up, up, up into the system and eventually nurturing the brain itself. So, what are some of the benefits of semen retention? I'm going to talk about this a little bit, but I want to talk very briefly, but somewhat in depth, about some of the benefits of semen retention, and there are many, many benefits. First of all, there is increased mental clarity. Indeed, an individual who loses semen on a regular basis loses the ability to think. They lose the ability to have a mind that is sharp and philosophical. They lose the ability to discern. Indeed, the mind, a well-functioning mind, is compared to a sharp sword in many of the Vedic scriptures. The way that you keep that mind sharp is indeed by retaining that semen within you. Let's go on. Increased energy. When you retain your semen, you overcome laziness. One thing that we've seen is that individuals who repeatedly, they masturbate, they watch pornography, they lose their semen. You see again and again that such individuals tend to be extremely lethargic. They tend to be very lazy. They're not motivated. It's hard for them to get up and do anything. What to speak of accomplish anything big. They're lucky if they can hold on to a job. These are individuals who indeed are cultivating laziness the more that they lose their semen. Let's go on. Stronger muscles. Yes, indeed. This is why throughout the history of athletics, throughout the history of bodybuilding, etc., stretching back to the ancient world, it's been understood that if a person wants to be a good athlete, if a person wants to be physically strong, if they want to grow muscles in the gym, etc., when you lose semen, you lose all those vital nutrients that are necessary. You lose proteins, etc., that are necessary to grow muscles. So if you're someone who, like me, you go to the gym all the time and you try to grow muscles, the more semen you lose unnecessarily, the harder that's going to be. So if you want stronger muscles, try to retain semen as much as possible. You get better sleep. This is something that is extremely important. Individuals who engage in semen retention tend to sleep a little bit better than most. The reason why this is the case is because their mind is not occupied by sex all the time. Rather, their mind tends to be occupied by higher things, which are more calming, etc. So that's when it's time to go to sleep. Sleep is a little bit better for them. Let's go on. Better, smoother hair. Again, there are nutrients in semen which, when you lose them, your hair becomes brittle rather than smooth and luxurious and beautiful looking. Your eyes become healthier and more radiant looking. This is why people have noted this all the time, that when you look at individuals who are celibate, they have eyes that look like they're on fire. They have eyes that look like they glow. They don't have these dull eyes where they look like they're half alive. No, rather, they have eyes that are alert, that are alive with energy. Let's go on. Glowing skin, indeed. If a man retains his semen, his skin even becomes better. If you have acne, anything like this, as a man, the best thing that you can do is indeed to retain your semen. Because again, the nutrients that are there, when you retain semen and it's inside of you, it begins to even affect your skin in such a way that your skin becomes beautiful and glowing and smooth and youthful looking, etc. Greater confidence, indeed, by not expelling semen all the time and rather keeping it within in a healthy sort of way. You will see that such individuals are extremely confident. That is, they speak with confidence. They carry themselves with confidence. This is why you look at, again, great sages. You look at someone like Prabhupada, and my Lord, if you look at images of Prabhupada, for those of you who never have, please go to YouTube, go to any sort of channel like this and look up film of Prabhupada, and you'll see someone who, this man had a healthy sense of confidence. Not arrogance, no, on the contrary, but a good, healthy sense of who he was, a happiness with who he was, and thus the ability to communicate confidently. This is something that you will grow if indeed you practice semen retention. Stronger immunity, absolutely. Absolutely. It's been shown that individuals who just lose semen all the time, they tend to get ill all the time. They tend to be individuals who they get colds all the time. These are individuals who, of course, are also susceptible to such things as COVID and flus, etc., etc. So rather, by retaining semen, you build your immunity factor. For men, you tend to have a voice that is heavier and deeper due to more testosterone. When you retain semen as a man, you have more testosterone. As a result, you have all of the benefits of that testosterone, which means that if you're a man and you retain semen, you start to feel and look and act like a man in every way. And the reason why is because, again, you are building that testosterone. For individuals who worry about this, and on the radio all the time, there are these ads for these clinics about how, if you're lacking testosterone, go here and we'll artificially give you testosterone. No, if you're lacking testosterone, or if you even suspect that you are, take a vow of semen retention even for 30 days, and you will see your testosterone go through the roof. I guarantee you. Higher motivation. This is something that we mentioned before. Indeed, when you are someone who you have this self-control, that you don't have to watch pornography and masturbate all the time and live in a fantasy realm, etc., etc., you have more motivation to do things in the real world and to be successful in the real world. You have the motivation to get out of the basement and to go out into the world and work hard and meet people and meet a wonderful, beautiful woman in real life, and have a healthy relationship and get married, etc. You have motivation to do the things of importance, and then spiritually as well, what to speak of spiritually. Again, this is indeed why early on in life, when a person is in this first ashram of Brahmacharya, the idea is that the reason why you retain your semen is because now you are building the motivation that you will need for the rest of your life to accomplish all the great things that you will do in your life. Well, even if you're older now, even if you're 40, even if you're 60, you can still build your motivation by indeed practicing semen retention. And as I've mentioned, it doesn't have to be something you do for the rest of your life, but you can experiment with this. Try it for 30 days. Try it for 90 days. Indeed, try it for a year, and see if your life will indeed change. You will add more time to your life. That's a given, because you're not going to be watching pornography anymore. You're not going to be constantly thinking about sex and sexuality and women and how do I find women, etc., etc. Rather, now with all this added time, you will have added time that you can now use toward actually doing something good for yourself, good with your time, etc. Spiritually, you can meditate more. Materially, make more money. Do something, but something positive with this time that you have. You will have added charisma. That is a given. That is a given. Indeed, it's something that throughout Vedic history, people have simply known that individuals, for example, politicians, someone like Gandhi, for example, the reason why Gandhi decided to be celibate is indeed for all of these benefits that I'm telling you about, but also he knew he was going to be a person who was going to be one of the leaders of Indian independence. He was going to be a politician. That being the case, he knew he needed charisma. So thus he became celibate. And indeed, it gave him that charisma to lead millions. In the same way, when an individual becomes celibate, they have a power to them. And it's a tangible power of force of their personality that would not be there otherwise. So indeed, if you want added charisma, and to then use that charisma for good, and not just for yourself or for selfish purposes, but indeed, if you want charisma to do good in this world, then practice semen retention. Now, this is an interesting one that I'm going to talk about, because it's somewhat paradoxical. When one practices semen retention, interestingly, one of the byproducts, a very tangible byproduct of semen retention, is that you indeed attract more women to yourself as a man. This is something that all serious monks, that all serious brahmacharis, that all serious people who indeed are celibate, whether for a long time, for a short period of time, they have all noted this, that they may have had difficulty just living a normal life, again, of rampant sexuality. They may have, during that time, have had a lot of difficulty attracting women to them. Indeed, many individuals who engage in too much loss of semen have a difficult time attracting women, interestingly. But then once they practice celibacy for a certain period of time, what they find is, inexplicably, women are now attracted to them. This is something that they have found again and again and again. And the reason why this is the case is because, indeed, when you practice semen retention, when you practice celibacy, your entire demeanor changes. Now suddenly you become the sort of person who does not give off sexual vibes anymore. And when women encounter you, rather than just seeing you as, oh yeah, just another guy who wants me, rather they understand, oh no, this is someone who's very different. This is someone who's not giving off any sort of sexual vibes toward me. As a result, they become comfortable around you. So interestingly, if your goal is indeed that you're a young man and you want to eventually find a good young woman to be with, and again, in a serious way, to develop a healthy relationship with the idea of eventually getting married, etc., and if you're having a difficult time attracting women to you, practice celibacy. Practice semen retention for some time. Again, not as a vow for life, but in a very healthy, spiritual sort of way. And what you will find is that sexual tension now being gone, now you will attract good and virtuous women toward you. They will be attracted to you like a magnet. That's the paradox of semen retention. Yeah, that there are so many benefits to semen retention that it is amazing. Spiritually speaking, this is the last thing that I'm going to mention, is that spiritually speaking, it makes meditation easier. It makes meditation easier. That for all the reasons that you can imagine, a vast variety of reasons. It's because as a person who is practicing celibacy, you now have more inner calm. You're not someone who is agitated all the time by sexuality. You're someone who has discipline. You're someone who on and on and on. You have now all the prerequisites that are necessary in order to have a successful meditation practice in your life. This is another thing that is extremely important about the practice of semen retention. Again, whether it's for 30 days, 90 days, 6 months, a year, however long you decide to do this, or even longer, actually, that it is really not possible to seriously practice semen retention unless you are a spiritual person and unless you have a regular meditation practice in your life. So the truth of the matter is both have to go hand in hand. That is, being a brahmachari on the one hand, but also having a very rich spiritual life on the other. Because all of this built up energy that you are now accumulating within you, within your body, within your psyche, etc., you do indeed have to engage it in some sort of way, and the very best way to do this is to transmute that energy spiritually. To transmute it spiritually by now engaging in as much sadhana as you can, and you will find that the sadhana itself, because you are celibate, has now become easier, has now become more fruitful, etc. Indeed, there are so many reasons to indeed practice Brahmacharya, to practice the way of the Brahmachari, to practice celibacy, semen retention, etc. And then conversely, to avoid all of these truly spiritually, psychically, in every way, debilitating practices of watching pornography, engaging in illicit sex of every description, whether it's masturbating, whether it's having multiple partners and having meaningless sex with multiple partners, etc. There are so many benefits to ridding yourself of these negative activities and then conversely practicing semen retention until it gets to the point where, again, you do indeed find a truly wonderful woman, someone who is your soulmate, someone who complements you wonderfully and who you can then marry and be with and have children and have a beautiful, wonderful Vedic family, etc. So for those of you who are presently practicing Brahmacharya, you know the benefits. For those of you who have not, but you're very curious, please try. Please try for some period of time to try to do this. And again, see this as a practice. You see, this is the thing, and this is the last thing I'm going to say. Too many people, unfortunately, approach the idea of celibacy in a very superstitious, very fanatical sort of way, with the idea that, if you, let's say, fall down for a moment from being a brahmachari, or if you are not a brahmachari or something, then necessarily you're engaging in sinful activity. And no, that's not the case. The truth of the matter is, being a brahmachari is something that's very practical. It's not a matter of guilt if you're not a brahmachari. It's not a matter of, you're going to go to hell if you're not a brahmachari. No, it's nothing like this. This is not some religious dogma. This is a matter of, like every other practice in Sanatana Dharma, like vegetarianism, like avoiding intoxicants, etc. This is a very practical thing that is meant to give you health and well-being in every single aspect of your life. So thus, if you're going to practice Brahmacharya, don't do so simply because not being a brahmachari makes you feel guilty or like you're an evil person. No, that's not a good motivator. Rather, practice Brahmacharya in a healthy way because you want to experience all of these healthy, wonderful benefits of being a brahmachari. So with that, again, I have so much more I could say. This easily could be, without exaggeration, a 3-hour talk on my part. So I'm going to end here. And with that, I would be very happy to take questions from people about the topic that we spoke about. Very good. So I see that indeed there are many questions here. Very good. Here's a very nice question from Majestic. Namaste Acharyaji. I find the modern age bombards youth with pornographic content more than ever before. From a Vedic perspective, how can a young man overcome the temptations of pornography and other explicit media to practice semen retention? Apologies if this question seems crass, but I felt it necessary to ask since many young men struggle with pornographic addiction. Your question is not crass in any way. Indeed, this is what we're here to talk about, to state it bluntly. This is the reality that indeed, as you said, many young men are indeed bombarded with pornography, and it is too easy to find these days, now due to the internet. It's literally a click away, and you have all sorts of pornographic things. Yes, to answer your question, the only way that an individual can avoid pornography is if they indeed choose to avoid pornography. In other words, let's say if you're talking about the typical youth who is not necessarily a spiritual person, who doesn't really understand the dangers, the damage that can be done by pornography, the addictive nature of pornography, etc. If none of this is in their mind, well, they're going to pursue pornography, and there's not much that can be done about that. But now, if you're talking about individuals who are consciously and purposefully pursuing spiritual life, well, for such individuals, that's a very different question, because now when they choose pornography, they are very consciously choosing to do so, knowing what the ill effects are. So the very best thing to do, of course, is to indeed avoid any such. And let's be honest, it tends to be websites. People don't really get magazines anymore. People don't read books anymore, for that matter. Everything is online. Individuals need to avoid such websites like the plague. If you, let's say, for example, watch such things on a regular basis. So now these things are in your history. Oh, get rid of them from your history. Lose the URLs to these sites, etc. Just do everything that you can to not purposefully go to these sites in any way whatsoever. And rather, if you're going to do things on the internet, if you're going to look for things, search for things of value on the internet, look for things that are actually going to help you. What does that mean? Spiritual things. Look up spiritual websites, spiritual videos, spiritual music, etc. And not just spiritual. Look up practical things. Grow your intellect, grow your mind, grow your knowledge base as much as possible. Look up everything from literature. There's great literature on the internet. Look up how-to videos, how to do woodwork, how to do plumbing, how to do anything. Literally look for anything that will help you to grow as a person. Look up videos on bodybuilding, look up videos on nutrition, etc. Look up anything that is actually positive that will help you to grow. Just make yourself stay away from the pornographic websites as much as possible. And truthfully, there's no magic to it. It's willpower. It's willpower. Like anything, these are addictions. So the greater the addiction, the more willpower it will take. But indeed, use the willpower. Hello, Acharyaji. I see you were reading about the effects of semen retention. Are there Vedic citations about the effects? If so, where can I find? Yes, indeed there are, and I'm not going to give you every Vedic citation because that would be impossible. You do the research yourself. Look into Ayurvedic texts, Charaka Samhita. Look into all of the Ayurvedic texts that exist. Many of these texts talk very specifically about semen retention. Look into the yogic texts as well. There are 20 yoga Upanishads. You can look those up very easily. Some of those talk about semen retention. So yes, you can do the research yourself. It is all throughout the Vedic scriptures that there's specific information and citations about semen retention. Here's an interesting question. Namaste, Acharyaji. What is the Vedic view on arranged marriage versus love marriage? Very nice, very good. Well, there are several different kinds of marriage that are recognized in the Vedic context. There are 8 different forms of marriage that are recognized in the Vedic context. That may come as a surprise to people that it's that many, but indeed the Vedic philosophy is vast, and it takes into account everything. So indeed, arranged marriage is one legitimate form of marriage, but interestingly, marriage for love also is considered to be a legitimate form of marriage in Vedic scriptures. Indeed, it's mentioned very specifically in many of the Vedic scriptures, including in the Ramayana, where, for example, when Sita married Rama, this was not an arranged marriage. This was a marriage of love. And again, there are many instances of such things. So as far as what is the Vedic view on such things, generally speaking, when you have a healthy, well-functioning Vedic society, that is, when you have community support, when you have an actual community that is based upon spirituality, the opposite of what we have now, where we have a radically fractured community that is based upon nothing but sense gratification. But when you have a healthy Vedic society and community and support structure and parents who themselves are paragons of virtue and who are following Vedic spirituality to the very best of their ability, the idea is that certainly there should be tremendous input on the part of the parents, that the parents should either arrange marriage between a boy and a girl, between a man and a woman, or at the very least they should approve of the marriage that takes place. And let me just say, this is not an Indian thing. It drives me crazy how people will talk about how, arranged marriages, that's how they do things in India. No, that's how they did things actually in every single traditional society. Indeed, I'm Italian. This is how things were done in Italian families up until only a few generations ago. For any individuals who you have grandparents or great-grandparents, you can ask them about this. Did people in our traditional societies just kind of get married, just because they fell into lust with one another, or did the families have a tremendous input in this? And they'll tell you, the latter. So indeed, the idea of arranged marriages, or at the very least, the parents having a very big say in who marries who, that's something that is traditionally done. But again, simply falling in love with, again, the right person, with the person who truly is your soulmate, that also is recognized as well. Very good. Here's an interesting question from Rudra Stormbringer. Jaya Shri Guru, are there any mystical attainments that we should work toward acquiring while in the Brahmacharya state so that we may use them to serve Sriman Narayana, or is such a desire counterproductive? Very nice. Excellent question. That is a truly good question, actually, because the truth of the matter is, in practicing Brahmacharya, and again, this is mentioned in the Vedic scriptures, in practicing Brahmacharya, it is indeed much, much easier to acquire what are called siddhis, or mystical attainments, literally mystical powers. This being the case, I'm very happy that you asked the question in the way that you did, and that is in order to use these things, such mystical attainments, to serve Sriman Narayana. So indeed, in being a Brahmachari, theoretically speaking, one can acquire all of the siddhis. That means the ability to levitate, the ability to materialize things, the ability to travel very long distances at the speed of mind, etc., etc. But these are not really the sorts of siddhis that a devotee of Sriman Narayana should even concern themselves with. Rather, the sorts of mystical attainments that one should attain are, as you said, mystical attainments that will help us to better serve God in every way. And what does that mean? Some of the things that I mentioned, that we should indeed be conscious and aware of the fact that we are becoming more charismatic, that we are becoming more penetrating in our mental abilities, etc., etc. All of these very practical things. We mustn't let these things get to our head as we see that as we retain semen more and more, we are gaining these abilities to a very great degree. We mustn't let these things go to our head, become prideful or arrogant about them. Rather, in a very humble way, we have to use all these things indeed to serve God. So I hope that answers the question somewhat. At what age do married householders take sannyas, and do they typically still live with their spouse? Very nice. Very good question. According to Manavadharma Shastra, what is sometimes called Manusmriti, a person first takes Vanaprastha, it is said, when they see the hairs on their head go gray, and when they see their son's son. At that time they take Vanaprastha. That's one stage before sannyasa. And at that stage you are still very, very much with your wife. That is very much the case. And the two of you together have retired. Now, of course, it's interesting. Remember earlier when I mentioned these 4 ashramas, I said how it's interesting how some of these in some ways even correspond with how things are done today. So at a certain age, let's say roughly 65 or so, people do indeed tend to go into retirement. Of course, in our materialistic world today, what that means is, oh, you go off to Florida and, play cards now or do something silly like that for the rest of your life. Well, in the Vedic context, it meant the opposite, that rather than now kind of wasting your time waiting to die, no, on the contrary, now you very much focus on becoming spiritual. But indeed, you do this as a couple, husband and wife together. When an individual takes sannyasa, that tends to be, as I mentioned, over the age of 75. 75 at the earliest. It can be much later. It can be 90, actually. It really depends on the person. But at that point, when you take sannyasa, indeed, at that point, you become celibate again, and you are no longer with your spouse. In this day and age, there are Vedic scriptures that actually explain that we do not take sannyasa in this age, in the Kali Yuga. That's actually mentioned in the Vedic scriptures. So the truth of the matter is that last ashrama is not compulsory. It's actually rather up to the individual. A person can choose to take sannyasa or not. It's completely up to the individual. But again, it's roughly at the age of 75 or above. Zarni, good question. Excellent question. Why did the media encourage wasting of semen? Yes, why indeed? Why indeed? Well, as we know, without getting in any way involved in politics, which I do not intend to in any way, shape, or form, but just speaking about this more from an ethical perspective, let's say, a perspective of good versus evil. As we know, the media is a captured media. The media exists for the sake of propaganda, and that propaganda being dictated by the evil individuals who have ruled over society, over the globe for quite a long time, actually. And one of the goals of such individuals is indeed to make the general populace as weak as possible. This is why, beginning really in the 1960s, they began to make such things as pornography and free sex and sexual exploration. I almost said exploitation, but that too, actually. Exploration and exploitation. They started to bring these things to public consciousness and push and push and push the idea that the opposite of what all the ancients have said. You know, modern evil, perverted, corrupted psychologists began telling us that no, you should express yourself sexually, otherwise you'll go crazy psychologically. No, you should have as much sex as possible. No, lose semen, lose semen, lose semen. This is what the media has actually been telling us for the last 50 years, at least, but certainly for the last 50 years. The reason why this is the case is because they want us in a weakened state. You can't control strong people, can you? You can only control people who are in a weakened state. When we lose semen, when our mind is occupied with sex, and sex, rather than thoughts of intelligence, rather than trying to figure out, who am I? Why am I here? Why am I suffering? Who's making me suffer? Who are these evil politicians? Do I really agree with what they're doing, etc., etc.? You see, not just the media, but the individuals who control the media, they want us in this weakened state of mind so we can't ask such questions. So indeed, it's by design that every time, let me state this bluntly, every time you masturbate, every time you lose semen on purpose, you are doing your enemies a tremendous favor. You're making your enemies happy. Indeed, they don't want us to practice celibacy. They want us to live like animals. Indeed, they want us to be cattle. We don't want to be their cattle. We're not going to be their cattle. So I hope that answers the question. Namaste Acharyaji, are there any specific mantras that we can chant or deities to pray to that could aid us in the practice of Brahmacharya? Very specifically, let me tell you, the mantras that you chant are those mantras that are to Narayana, those mantras that are specifically to God. And as far as any deities you pray to, you need to go directly to God. Very, very specifically. When it comes to this question of celibacy, of semen retention, etc., the practice of Brahmacharya, indeed, look at the very term itself. Brahma, meaning Brahman, and then Charya, meaning conduct, so divine conduct. The idea of Brahmacharya is indeed to know God very deeply, very intimately, and we can know God through Brahmacharya like we cannot know almost in any other way. Being celibate, retaining semen, and again, either for a long period of time, it doesn't have to be for all of our lives, but for that period of time in which we are practicing semen retention, we have the ability to open ourselves to God's grace in a way that is truly astounding. So that being the case, we are to appeal very directly to God, not to any devas or devis. I can tell you this very, very directly. So indeed, Om Namo Narayanaya is the best mantra for practicing Brahmachari, and very specifically, focusing all of our devotional awareness on Narayana, on Sriman Narayana. This is the best way to practice Brahmacharya. Good. Here is an interesting question. Thanks for your talk, Acharyaji. My pleasure. How to have meaningful and deep relationships with women as a Brahmachari without ending up with them attracted sexually and disappointed. Yeah, so how to have meaningful, deep relationships with women as a Brahmachari without becoming attracted and falling down from Brahmacharya, etc. Let me tell you, it's extremely difficult, and I'll be very honest with you. In fact, I have several verses that I was going to quote, but just due to lack of time, I decided to skip over quite a few things. But there are verses from the Vedic scriptures that make it quite clear. If you are a Brahmachari, you are to, as much as is possible, avoid the company of women. And this is just a very practical thing. We do not hate women. We love women. Vedic spirituality is the opposite of Abrahamism. We cherish women. We love women. We honor women. We respect women. It has nothing to do with anything like that. It has to do with retaining our vow and keeping away from any sort of temptations. The Vedic scriptures make it quite clear that if you want to practice Brahmacharya very successfully, You need to avoid women as much as possible. Now, your family, that's different. Of course, your mother, sister, daughter, anything like that, that's a very different sort of thing. But when it comes to women who are attractive, who potentially you could have a relationship with, as much as is feasible, you want to avoid their company. That doesn't mean you shun them. That means that, yes, you try to minimize your contact with them as much as possible. So it's very difficult to have a close relationship with such women if you are going to practice Brahmacharya for a long period of time. That is the answer. Very good. Here is another question from Rudra Stormbringer. Jai Shri Guru. Is the Kama Sutra considered an authentic text within the Vedic canon? Very good. I'm glad you asked this, actually. In the Western world, especially, whenever any individual hears the word sutra, unfortunately, the first thing they think of, I'm talking about the common individual, first thing they think of is Kama Sutra. If you're lucky, maybe a distant second will be the Yoga Sutra. But unfortunately, the vast, vast majority of just typical Westerners, when they hear the word sutra, that's what they think of. Indeed, the Kama Sutra, interestingly, is indeed considered to be an important text. It is a sutra. It's written by Vatsyayana. Vatsyayana was a sage. Vatsyayana, interestingly, a lot of people don't know this. I always have to point this out to people because it seems very odd to people that on the one hand, you have all these various scriptures and texts and books written by all these sages and rishis and yogis, etc., that focus on all of these very exalted topics such as philosophy and spiritual practice and yoga, etc., etc. But then you have the Kama Sutra, which deals with sex. It deals with sexuality. And people are often very confused about this. Well, it shouldn't be confusing if you understand that Vedic civilization is precisely that. It's not a sect, it's a civilization. And what does a civilization mean? That means a civilization is something that necessarily takes all things into account. It takes into account every single aspect of the human experience. Well, that has to include sexuality. So indeed, Vatsyayana was a sage, he was a yogi. Interestingly, a lot of people are not aware of this. He says this himself in the Kama Sutra. When he wrote the Kama Sutra, he was a Brahmachari. He was not practicing sex when he wrote the Kama Sutra. He wrote the Kama Sutra, indeed, for those individuals who are married and for them to indeed explore healthy sexuality within a monogamous married Vedic context. You'll remember we talked about the Purusharthas, these four aims of man. Dharma, Artha, Kama, Moksha. What's the third one? Kama. Kama Sutra. So again, this is one of the aims of man, but within the proper context. Unfortunately, of course, today there are so many translations of the Kama Sutra. It's available on every, in every corner bookstore, etc. And people think it's a sex manual, regardless of who you are, what stage of life you're in, etc. No, it's not the case. It is a manual on, indeed, how to enjoy the pleasures of sexuality within the context of a healthy and virtuous Vedic monogamous relationship between a man and a woman. That is the purpose of the Kama Sutra. So it is indeed legitimate if practiced the right way. All right. Very good. Let's go on. There are quite a few very nice questions here. Very good. Here is a good question by Dharma Knight. Beloved Acharyaji, if I'm not being too bold, why is it that I have heard much about the idea that celibacy is unhealthy and can be dangerous? Is there any merit to this? Very good. The reason why you have heard this is for the same reason why you have heard that pornography is liberating. And that engaging in every sort of perverse, degenerated sort of sexual activity is liberating. It's propaganda. It's simply not true. No, this comes from Freudianism, this demented idea that indeed, unless a person is engaged in sex 24 hours a day, expelling semen, then psychologically you will go crazy. Psychologically, this will be damaging to you. This is something that goes back to Freud, who was a truly demonic, atheistic individual. There's no basis in reality to this. celibacy is something that is extremely healthy for you. At the same time, I have also said, as I repeated maybe 100 times during the course of my talk, celibacy is not something that for the vast majority of individuals, it's not something that's meant to be followed for the rest of your life, literally from the time you're born until the time you die. It has its place within one's life. So it's not that you are to never engage in sexuality. No, on the contrary, when you're young, you should be celibate. That is, again, when a person is up until around the age of 22, 23, 25, varying, a person should be celibate. And then certainly at the tail end of your life, you should be celibate. And then if you choose periods in between, where for a short period, 30 days, 90 days or something, you take a vow of celibacy, then that's perfectly fine. Otherwise, most people should get married, have healthy married lives, raise healthy, wonderful, happy, spiritual families, and engage in the pleasures of kama, the pleasures of sex. That is the Vedic way. There is no restriction on engaging in the pleasures of sexuality when you are practicing, again, sexuality within the context of a healthy Vedic marriage. So, indeed, a person is not meant to be celibate for literally all of one's life. Otherwise, no, there's nothing unhealthy about being celibate, or certainly dangerous in any way. A person's brain is not going to explode. I've never heard of anything like that, so don't worry about that. Very good. Here is a good question from 10th Incarnation. If all our activities should be for God's pleasure rather than our own, but sexual activity within marriage intentionally not resulting in procreation is for one's own pleasure, how can these two things be reconciled? Very easily. And indeed, yes, let me talk about this actually. This is unfortunately, this is something I can talk about for a long time. I'm going to constrain myself a little bit only because we're approaching this 2 hours. I don't want this to go on for too long for people. But let me just say, there are many activities that we engage in for our own pleasure alone that aren't necessarily something that is directly productive, but that we can still use in God's service. Taking a walk in nature, we're not really producing anything. We are experiencing the pleasure of walking in nature. And I can give 1,000 other examples. When we are eating food, we choose food that tastes very good, that tastes nice. And if we're eating something healthy that doesn't taste good versus something healthy that does taste good, of course we're going to veer toward the thing that is healthy that tastes good. Is there not a difference between the two? Of course there is. So one could easily say, well, why not just eat the things that don't taste good that are healthy and dedicate those to God? Because there's nothing wrong actually in experiencing pleasure in God's service. There's absolutely nothing wrong in experiencing pleasure in God's service. Again, there is this ascetic sort of idea that comes more from the Abrahamic cults, more so than from Vedic spirituality, that pleasure itself is something that is an evil. That is not the case. Indeed, the yogi takes pleasure also in the food that they eat, in what they're seeing around them, in all the things of this world. There's nothing wrong in taking pleasure in all the things of this world, while at the same time recognizing that that pleasure, A, comes from God. It is a gift from God. B, it is something that enjoyed in a sattvic way will actually serve to elevate me in every way. It will elevate one's mood. It will elevate one's sense of positivity, etc. And more, it's something that can be used in God's service if you understand that God is the source of this. And thus, it's almost a form of karma yoga in which you are acknowledging that this is of God. And indeed, you are engaging, interestingly, even in sexual pleasure in God's service and in awareness of God. So now let me deal very specifically with how you ask this. If all our activities should be for God's pleasure rather than our own, and again, there is nothing wrong in our deriving pleasure in pleasing God. You see, it's not one or the other. It's not either or. It's not that, it's all for God's pleasure, therefore that means I suffer. No, the true devotee gains pleasure in pleasing God and doing things for God's pleasure. So that's the first thing. So I hope that answers the question. I can go much, much deeper, but Again, little time, and there are so many more questions here, so I want to look at a few more of these. Namaste, Sri Acharyaji. Are there any benefits for women who wish to practice Brahmacharya? Indeed, there are, not semen retention. However, there are other benefits. So again, you'll remember I mentioned this earlier on, how when it comes to semen retention, physiologically, there's no way around this. This is not a matter of discrimination. It's not a matter of misogyny. It's not a matter of blah, blah, blah. It's a matter of physically, men and women have different equipment. So thus, that being the case, it is indeed the case that because women do not have semen, semen retention is not a concern for women. However, brahmacharya itself is indeed something that early in life, and it has to be early in life, can indeed benefit women too, in that it helps young women, girls, to cultivate such qualities as indeed discipline, as appreciation for the power of sexuality. See, this is something that's interesting. People today disrespect the power of sexuality because they have sexual encounters so often. It is when you practice celibacy that you now have a respect for this power of sexuality, and on and on. So yes, there are benefits that women would have from brahmacharya as well, but again, really when they are younger in life. So as they are young children, teenagers, etc. But semen retention is not one of them. Ah, very good. Here is an interesting question. This is from Sun Lotus. Sri Acharyaji, some Ayurvedic texts I have read state that a person can have excess seminal fluid and then become aggravated and have excessive sexual desire. How should an individual properly channel that energy when this takes place after having retained semen? Excellent, excellent question. That is a very good question. And this is why you'll remember earlier on I was explaining, but then I didn't have an opportunity to go in depth into this. I was explaining how celibacy, charya, practiced in the correct way can be healthy. So this is why, again, there is the general Western sense of being celibate. And yeah, this is why you'll find Catholic priests, for example, or Catholic monks, the ones who actually do try to be celibate, who will seem like very grouchy people. That's because they don't know what they're doing. It's because they don't have the tools, the equipment necessary to then transmute that power in such a way that it becomes a positive. So those are the people who become sexually frustrated and then take that out on other people. But no, this is why we need to practice yoga and meditation in addition to practicing semen retention. It is indeed true that, like with any fluid, it can get to the point where you do indeed begin to have too much semen. And what do you do? This is why when one begins to practice meditation and yoga and all of these sadhanas, what then happens is that physical aspect of the semen becomes transmuted into then ojas, and into then prana, and into then the finer non-physical elements that then begin to nurture the subtle body, that begin to then nurture the sukshma sharira. So in other words, that semen doesn't just build up, build up, build up, but rather becomes transmuted to the point where it goes from physical to subtle and energetic. So in that way, a person can be celibate and can retain semen without that aggravation happening. But if they don't know how to do this, and there are yogic processes, again, just look them up. Just look up any of the 20 yoga Upanishads. There are 20 Upanishads that deal very specifically with yoga, etc. And if you look these up, these will have some of the practices that you do to specifically focus on transmuting that seminal essential substance to then finer substance. Hope that answers the question. So, Jai Shri Guru. How do we live in detachment and focus on Bhagavan and still seek out a good woman to marry and then start a family? Good. By first of all realizing that the two are not at odds. That is, by being devoted to God on the one hand, but also wanting to be with a good woman, be married, etc. Those are not at odds with each other. On the contrary, they are exactly on the same path. They are complementary with each other. Of course, today in 2021, especially in the Western world, but now affecting the whole world, what it means to quote unquote find a woman is something radically different from the healthy way in which we would seek a partner in the past. Of course, today, what does that mean in the minds of the common individual? Oh, that means going to a bar. That means going to, places where you find singles partying, etc. No, this is not how we find a good woman. The way that we find a good woman is going to where good women are. This is the thing that always astounded me is individuals who complain, oh, I can never find, whatever gender they are. Oh, I can never find a good man. I can never find a good woman. Oh, where are you looking? Oh, bars. Or crazier places even than that. Well, you should go to where good men and good women are. This is where you find them. What does that mean? That means places where sattvic people congregate. That means that indeed you go to Vedic temples, you go to places where Vedic people congregate, you go to even churches. If you, let's say, you don't have a Vedic community anywhere near you. I believe in one of my talks that became a video maybe a year ago, I mentioned this. Oh, if you have no choice, go to a church community where at the very least you'll find some women who are pious, who are virtuous, etc. And then religiously, maybe in time you can coax them to beginning to follow Sanatana Dharma, but you go wherever you find good women and you don't pursue them in a sexual sort of way. The idea is not to look for sex partners, that's out of the question. The idea is not even so much to look for a wife necessarily. The idea, more than anything, at first, is to look for a good friend, to look for the company of women who you have much in common with, who are spiritual, who are inspiring to you, who you have a lot who you can talk to about, etc., etc. And hopefully that relationship will develop into something healthy. But the idea that indeed looking for a healthy relationship with a woman who will then be a wife, the idea that that is at odds with being detached and being dedicated to God, no, that's not the case. This is actually the healthy Vedic way, that we devote ourselves to God, that we have detachment, and at the same time, we want to be with a good partner so that we can fulfill all the various aspects of our life that need to be fulfilled both spiritually and materially. So I hope that answers the question there. So this is Sun Lotus again with another very good question. How can women support their significant other while he is practicing Brahmachari and also maintain a healthy and positive relationship with one another? Excellent, excellent question. And a question that every good woman married to a good man should ask, actually, if indeed he is trying to practice Brahmacharya. Several things. First of all, there is the understanding that has to be there. In other words, you need to understand why indeed he feels that it is of importance for him to practice Brahmacharya. So, in a way, try to enter into his mind, try to see things from his perspective, try to understand why he feels that this is something of crucial importance that he has to do. So, it begins with understanding. Then, with that understanding, certainly do everything that you can to not try to tempt him in any way to lose semen, because ultimately this is what we're talking about. You're talking about a woman who has, as you say, a significant other who is trying to practice brahmacharya. So for a period of time, what that means is he's trying to practice semen retention more than anything. He's trying not to lose semen. Well, try your best to not do anything to tempt him to do so. So that means even sexually, don't try to do anything in which he would lose semen. That means just, don't try to coax him verbally into trying to lose semen, et cetera, et cetera. And more than anything, especially as he is practicing this, try your best to support his mood as much as possible, understanding that to be celibate is a tapasya. It is an austerity. Doesn't matter who you are, doesn't matter how you're doing it, either early in life, late in life, as a short vrata or vow. It is something that is not an easy thing. And that's something I should have mentioned earlier. I don't want people to get the false impression that being celibate, even with all the benefits, that it's something that you can just kind of switch on, switch off with zero problem whatsoever, especially in our day and age when the entire culture is so sexualized. No, this is a tapasya. It's something that is a difficulty. It's something that the man has to be aware of, and they have to avoid temptations. And the woman may or may not be aware of this, but the man is trying his best to not look at women, to not think sexual thoughts, to not engage in activities that again will encourage him to lose semen in any way. But that's the main thing, is that he does not want to lose semen. So just in every way that you can, help him to maintain that. Very good. Here's 10th incarnation again. If one spouse were to die early in married life, is taking sannyasa while still young advisable or acceptable rather than remarriage? What is the Vedic view on remarriage? Very nice. Well, we do have instances of individuals, very virtuous individuals in the Vedic scripture, who did indeed get remarried after their wife died. And we're talking very specifically about men who their wife died and then they ended up getting remarried. There are several sages, several individuals, kings, etc., for who that's the case. So as far as remarriage, yes, there's nothing wrong with getting remarried, and especially for the man if the wife dies early. As far as taking sannyas while still young, again, sannyas is for the man specifically. There are some women who take sannyas. They're called sannyasinis, but that's just a little bit more rare. Mostly we're talking about men, but again, not exclusively. There are women who do indeed take sannyas. But for men specifically, again, it's not advisable that they take sannyasa while they are young. So it is actually advisable that, let's say they're 30, 40 years old and their wife passes away. It's better that they actually get remarried and then take sannyasa at the proper time. It's important to go through the entire system if you're going to do this properly. You're a Brahmachari, you're a Grihastha, you're a Vanaprastha, then sannyasa when you're past the age of 75. That's the proper way of doing it. Sri Acharyaji, this question might be a bit unrelated, but what do you think about polygamy and the ability for certain leaders to have polygamous relationships? Good question, actually. Polygamy is something that is found all throughout the ancient world. It's found in the Bible. It's found indeed in the Vedic scriptures. However, in the Kali Yuga, it is something that there's no need to practice polygamy whatsoever. Rather, we believe in monogamous relationships today, one man, one woman. That's why I repeat this so often in so many of my different videos. There's no purpose for polygamy whatsoever. It doesn't serve any purpose whatsoever, regardless of what the man is, regardless if the man deems himself to be a king or whatever. It is better to just have a monogamous relationship between one man and one woman. Otherwise, everything else is just fantasy as far as people wanting to practice polygamy today. It is not Treta Yuga. Very good. All right, this is Sun Lotus again. What is proper etiquette between men and women within the context of being in a relationship and having friendships with people of the opposite gender? For example, would it be appropriate for a single woman to hang out with or give hugs to male friends? Sorry, one moment, it's getting cut off. Who is in a relationship with someone and vice versa? How can people maintain appropriate boundaries and respect one's significant other while also having healthy friendships with others? I hope that makes sense. Thank you so much for this talk. Yeah, it does make absolute sense. As far as the etiquette, I assume you're talking about, let's say, for example, a married couple, husband and wife, and they're married, they're in a very healthy Vedic relationship, etc. And when it comes to the idea of, let's say, the wife having male friends, the husband having female friends, etc., yes, when it comes to friendships like that, that should be avoided as much as is possible. Not completely. Certainly, friendships can be there. But as far as quite literally, let's say the wife having an exclusive best friend who is a guy, yes, that's treading on very dangerous territory. That's something that should be avoided as much as possible. Having general friends, certainly that's fine, of any gender. But again, it's something that a person wants to be very, very careful with as much as is possible. You want to minimize it on the one hand, but on the other hand, you don't want to also jeopardize good friendships on the other. It's possible to be friends with people of the opposite gender without having to just hang out, let's say, the wife with some other guy or the husband with some other woman, just exclusively together alone. That should be avoided as much as possible. So, in other words, such friendships should be in a group setting, more so than just someone who is a married wife going off to hang out with a male friend alone in his apartment. No, that's something that would be terrible, a terrible thing to do. Here's a good question. Retirement should also be reserved to giving out your accumulated knowledge, right? Absolutely. Yes, definitely. The idea of retirement, again, in the modern West versus during Vedic times is something that is radically, radically different. Again, what's the idea in the modern West, especially America, but this is true all throughout the West? It's the idea that, okay, you're I'm I'm just giving the common idea here. Okay, you're old, you're all used up. Now just kind of get ready to die. Go off somewhere where you can play shuffleboard and be out of everyone's way, be in a nursing home, etc. And that's about it. That's the idea of retirement in the modern age. And unfortunately, that is truly terrible. That does a disservice to older people who are indeed elders who should be respected. That does a disservice to all of society because indeed, as you ask here, the elders in society are individuals who have accumulated knowledge for decades and decades. And these are individuals who now have the ability to share that knowledge with the younger generation and all the people around them. So indeed, these are people who once you're retired, such people should do that. They should endeavor to share their lifetime of accumulated wisdom with society around them, with younger people, with children, especially. So, yes, that was a very good question. So, I will end here. Thank you all very much for being here. This is the very first Discord talk like this that I have given. I've given other Discord talks, but in a more very private setting. But this is the first talk I've given like this. And I think this was very, very successful. And I think that in the future, once in a while, we will indeed do such things again. I will give an exclusive Discord talk and then take questions from people. And I thank you all again for being here. I hope this was helpful in many, many different ways. And with that, I thank you all very much for being here with me. Namaste. Jaya Shriman Narayana. Jaya Bhagavan Shri Krishna. Jaya Shri Guru. Sanatana Dharma Jayate. Dharma Rashtra Jayate. International Sanatana Dharma Society Jayate.